Hello guys, this is Yehuda Lee. I am coming to you with a lesson. This lesson is going to concern whether or not we have everything we need to study the Most High's Word. What I mean by that is, as I go through this presentation, there are some of us that are exposed to different material outside of the King James Version, so that's what I want to do for this particular video. I know it may be boring for those of us that are in the know, but one thing I began to realize is all of us are at different levels of understanding. All of us at different levels of awakening. So when we talk about studying our scriptures or our history book, the question is, do we have everything that we need? And for a lot of us, the answer is no, or the exposure to different books hasn't occurred yet. So I want to put together a quick video and expose some of these things so that we can all put together pieces of the puzzle, come into an understanding, because this is our age of reawakening. So when we talk about searching the scriptures, there's several things that we want to look at within the scriptures in terms of how we're supposed to be seeking His Word, why we're seeking His Word, why things are not laid out in a way where everybody can understand, because He's told us within His scriptures that He will make it like a puzzle, put pieces here, put pieces there. Anyway, so let's first look at Proverbs 15:28, and it says, "The heart of the righteous studieth to answer, but the mouth of the wicked poureth out evil things." So he's telling us right there that we should be studying His Word. Proverbs 25:2, "It is the glory of the Most High to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings to search out a matter." So again, he's telling us, search His face, search His wisdom, look through His scriptures for everything that we need concerning our salvation, concerning living right amongst each other, honoring Him. Everything is in the Word. And we'll look at one more scripture, I believe. So Isaiah 28, 9 and 10. "Whom shall He teach knowledge? And whom shall He make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little." So again, he's showing us that throughout these scriptures, he's going to be putting pieces of the puzzle throughout the entire books. Everything's not going to be laid out. He's also told us, and I'm paraphrasing, some will understand and some won't, even if you read the same thing. I don't have the scripture right in front of me, but it's in there. Anyway, so with these three scriptures, you can see that he wants us to study His Word and really study it, because everything is not going to be some things won't be as evident as others in terms of what He says according to law. So now when we look at the Old Testament, or the books of the Old Testament, we've got a lot to look at. And one thing we need to do as we're studying this Word is ask ourselves, do we have everything in front of us that will answer the questions that we have, or do we have all of the Most High's words, or access to the Most High's Word? Well, it's a yes or no. But anyway, when we break down the Old Testament, we can see that they are put together in certain ways. So we have the law, and that's usually your first 5 books. Some people call them books of Moses. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All right. And then you have what they call the prophets, and these were folks that believed in the Most High and began to prophesy or to judge against Israel or against other nations concerning the treatment of Israel. So those are those books there. I won't read them all off, but I'm sure you're familiar with these books, but I'm just breaking it down for those that are coming into understanding recently, or coming back, or whatever the case may be, wherever you are on your walk. Then you have the writings. And they aren't necessarily in order that you're used to, I guess, with the King James Version. I just threw them down to give you a breakdown of how these books are categorized. All right. So even with that, you have to ask yourself, well, do I have everything? And I'm particularly talking about a newer version of the King James. Do I have everything that was written or that was inspired by the Most High? And for those of us in the know, we know that the answer is no. We know that during the time where the Grecians were coming into power, Israel was already separated, already enslaved, and there were certain other big events that were going on. And one of the events was when the Grecians were coming into power. We were basically told that we can no longer worship the Most High the way that we wanted to, or we would be put to death. And we can find those things through one of the hidden books called the Book of Maccabees, or the first book of Maccabees. So I'm just going to read chapters 3, verses 46 through 48, just to give you an idea of what's going on. All right. So remember, so at this point in time, the Grecians had already come into the temple. They defiled the temple by putting unclean beasts on the altar. You know, that was against our law. Just to mock us, they were doing these things. So in verse 46, you can see it says, "Wherefore the Israelites assembled themselves together and came to Masphah over against Jerusalem. For in Masphah was the place where they prayed oftentimes in Israel." Verse 37, "Then they fasted that day," and this is the Israelites, "and then they fasted that day and put on sackcloth and cast ashes upon their heads and rent their clothes." The Israelites were in distress. The temple was being sacked or defiled, and they didn't know what to do. This was a time of war. We were still enslaved, and the Grecians were coming into power and basically telling us we will be put to death if we do not honor their laws, and that comes into play today. Anyway, so this is the verse next that I want to focus on, verse 48. And it says, "And laid upon the book of the law." All right, so the book of the law, that's our writings, but you want to be more specific, those are the first 5 books of the Bible, or our history book. You know, I prefer to use that term, our history book, not the Bible. But anyway, "And laid upon the book of the law, wherein the heathen," this would be the Grecians, or non-Israelites, "the heathen had sought to paint the likeness of their images." Let me reread that. "And laid upon the book of the law, wherein the heathen had sought to paint the likeness of their images." So basically, they took our books, as we would have chosen, we were the elect. Those books are our books. And what they were doing was they were writing in their own images in our books. It went from, and again, I don't believe in Jesus, but it went from a black Jesus to a white Jesus. You know, they're writing themselves into our history, which is really what was going on at that time. And that's why you had the Hellenists. You had a whole bunch of stuff going on. And you can look that term up, the Hellenists. Those were the Greek-speaking Jews, and they began to follow the laws of the Grecians. But anyway, so that's something that I want you to remember as we move on through this talk or discussion that we're having, is, do we actually have everything? Because if they're painting themselves into our books, then we also have to remember that there's some things in our books they might not like. They may not want that information to get out. So that's why I keep asking, do we have everything that we need to follow the Most High? Do we have all of His laws? Do we have all of His instructions? Do we have other writings that will help us get from day to day in terms of our faith? Well, the answer is no. And how do we know this? Because there's such thing as an Old Testament Apocrypha, right? So the Apocrypha are what they call the hidden books. And I want to make a point here. So before I'll just say the early 1800s, the Apocrypha was included in our history books, right? And they included books of things that were going on. And some of these, we broke it down to the other categories that I mentioned earlier: writings, law, prophets, and I forget the third one or the fourth one. But anyway, so these books fell into those categories. Now, when you look at Fourth Ezra, or some people say Second Esdras, and First and Second Maccabees, I mean, it really gave you an idea of what was going on. It was more emphatically saying who we are as a people. Even Second Baruch. I mean, those books are no joke. They're basically spelling out who we are and who they are. And when you begin to read it and have an understanding, you can see why they hid these books. Case in point, and this is just me talking. So in the 1611 King James Version, these books were included in the in our history books or the Bible, right? What happened in 1617, or supposedly happened in 1617? Well, supposedly the first slave had come here to the United States. And one of the laws they said was you're not supposed to be able to read. Well, a lot of us could read because a lot of us were brought from Europe as well. A lot of us were learned people. And this is when you talk about slavery, there's a whole different subject, but I'm trying to make a point here. When they realized we could read, or later on in the centuries, in the 17 and 1800s, when they said it's legal for blacks or whatever name you want to give us to read, they didn't want us to have access to this information. They didn't want us to realize who we are. So they snatched these books out. And they're in the know. They know who we are. But again, these books paint a different picture, or actually I should say provide extra pieces to the puzzle. And they don't want us knowing that. The enemy does not want us knowing that. Okay, let's look at the Apocrypha. So let's look at a definition. And I am actually using the Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. So let's quickly talk about some aspects of what the Apocrypha is. All right, so it's a group of books written during the time and turmoil and history of the Jewish people from 200 BC to about 100 AD, about 300 years, part of those 400 years that tell us that have been missing. These books fall into two main divisions: the Old Testament apocryphal books and the New Testament apocryphal books. The Old Testament books have 15 in number, were written during the period about 150 BC to about AD 70, when the Jewish people were in rebellion against the repression of foreign military rulers. These books were excluded from some early versions of the Old Testament, but included in others. This explains why Bibles used by Roman Catholics contain Old Testament Apocrypha, while they are not included in most Protestant editions of the Bible. There's also a New Testament Apocrypha. So the books known in the New Testament Apocrypha were written during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, long after the death of the apostles and other witnesses to the life and ministry of Jesus. None of these books were included in the New Testament because they were judged as unworthy and not authoritative by officials of the early church. Okay, so let's read further. So here we're going to start or resume. The Old Testament Apocrypha. So a series of events that led to the writings of the Old Testament apocryphal books began in 167 BC when the Jews revolted against the king of Assyria, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. A pious Jewish priest, Mattathias, and his sons led the rebellion. Mattathias refused to obey Antiochus' command that the Jews worship his gods and offer a pagan sacrifice. Mattathias killed the Syrian official as well as the fellow Jew who was offering the sacrifice, and declared, "Follow me, every one of you who is zealous from the law and strives to maintain the covenant." He and his sons took to the hills, leaving all their belongings behind in the town. So I'm going to skip this paragraph, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of what was going on and what these books were talking about. So this talks about the guerrilla warfare. So they were fighting against the Assyrians and their oppressors. Anyway, so starting here, so it says these events, the fighting, helped stir the Jewish people to rededicate themselves to the laws of Moses because they were being forbidden to do so. In the fight to establish their independence and uphold their traditions, some Jewish authors wrote to encourage their own people. The apocryphal books show clearly that the authors were enthusiastic for faith in the Most High and to study His Word. All right. So all in all, these apocryphal books were written in order to encourage the Jews, Hebrews, Israelites, whatever name you want to give them. But anyway, so that's what the apocryphal books are. All right. So it's not just the Apocrypha. We have something called the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. And there's a wealth of books, right? A wealth of books. I mean, you got, I already mentioned Baruch, but you have 3rd and 4th Baruch. You got the books of Enoch, the book of Jubilees. I don't have it on this list, but there's a book of Jasher, Jasher. And if you look through the Old Testament, I forget exactly where, there is a reference to the book of Jasher. So it makes you think, well, wait a minute. If they're referencing it in the King James Version, where is this book? Well, the book of Jasher, just like Jubilees, gives a lot of details about the books of the law that aren't in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. All right? So anyway, so my point is there are a lot of books out here that you can say are God inspired, whatever the case may be, but it talks about the Israelites and who they are. And unfortunately, some of these books in the Pseudepigrapha, depending on which version of these books that you have or how it's put together, they'll even tell you that there's a Christian influence. So basically what that means is they took our books, and just like in 1 Maccabees 3:48, they started rewriting or taking certain things out and planting certain things in, just to go along with their propaganda. All right. So now, using the same dictionary, let's talk about what the Pseudepigrapha is. So the Pseudepigrapha is a collection of Jewish books, right here, containing various forms of literature using names of famous people in Israel's history for titles of the books. The real authors are unknown. I don't believe that. Not completely anyway. Such names as Ezra, Baruch, Enoch, Solomon, Moses, and Adam are used to add authority to the writings. All right, so let's skip this, but anyway, I want to focus right here. One problem addressed by the Pseudepigrapha books is, why do the wicked seem to prosper and the righteous suffer? Books like Jubilee, Enoch, and 4th book of Ezra develop a careful scheme of history that shows the power of the world in the hands of the ruler of this age. The ruler of this age is Satan, or Belial. The present age will end with the Most High as Lord of all nations. The books of the Pseudepigrapha were written by pious Jews living in either Palestine or Egypt. They were concerned that the Jews live according to the law of Moses. So, believe it or not, there is a New Testament Apocrypha, and these are things that are writings that didn't make it into the New Testament. Now, I am on the fence about whether or not I think the New Testament is, I'll just say I use it as a reference because, like I said, in 1 Maccabees 3:48, they took our writings, basically created their own story or wrote themselves into our history. So when I look at the New Testament or New Covenant, I don't believe that the Most High will change his mind. But anyway, so I look at the New Testament as a reference because most of the New Testament, most of the New Testament goes back to scriptures that are in the Old Testament. So to me, this is just my opinion, it's a rewrite. Now, yes, we can use it as a reference. Yes, we can use it as pieces of the puzzle. But my point here for this particular talk is there are still other books out there that we're not being exposed to, right? Right now, we're in the age of understanding, or we're waking up, the Israelites. We're waking up realizing who we are, right? But anyway, so if you just look at this list, and you can research it, try to get it on Amazon or whatever the case may be. You'll see these books out here. And some of these books, well, most of them in the New Testament Apocrypha, I have not read. I will read, so I can't stamp to say they are 100% authentic. I'm just putting the information out there that there's, or telling you that there's more information out there that can be researched, that can be used as pieces of the puzzle. All right, so again, I referred to this Bible verse several times, and 1 Maccabees 3:48. And again, they laid open the book of the law, our book, our history book, the books that belong to us, the Israelites, wherein the heathen, the non-Israelites, had sought to paint the likeness of their images. Another book I want to look into is called the Bible Reader's Aid. So basically what this book is, it can be used for Sunday school teachers or as a history book to kind of reference some of the things within our written history books or our Bible. Things like pictures or scrolls found, or if you want to give a particular sermon or whatever the case may be, it's a quick reference. But one thing I wanted to point out to this, because I'm not a big proponent. I don't believe in Jesus Christ. And I'm saying all that to say that the passage that I showed you earlier concerning 1 Maccabees 3:48, when they stole our books and pretty much wrote themselves into our history. Well, here is a section here in the book, page 97. It's called the New Testament Quotations from the Old. All right, so remember, they stole our books and wrote themselves in. All right. So when you start talking about the New Testament, like right here you have the book of Matthew, and you can see, I mean, almost chapter for chapter, verse for verse, you can see where it's pulling information from the Old Testament or precepts, right? So this particular one, Matthew 4:4, is pulling from Deuteronomy. This one, Matthew 5:14, is pulling from the book of Isaiah, and so on and so on, right? So that's the book of Matthew, right? So then we move over, move that out the way. You got the book of Mark, same thing, right? Here you go. Mark 7:6 and 7 is pulling from Isaiah. Mark 11:9 is pulling from Psalms 118, 25, and 26. And it goes on and on. Same with the book of Luke. All the books. All the New Testament books. And you may be saying, well, so what? Well, again, my point is they stole our books and wrote themselves into our history. And if you don't know this, that's when you kind of get lost. And some of these pastors are only teaching from the New Testament. And you think, well, hey, there's a new way, or the law does no longer exist. Well, the law does exist, but that's a completely different subject. But, well, wait a minute, to kind of prove my point about the law. All right, so anyway, so I jumped around, but anyway, book by book. And you can see references back to the Old Testament, right? Timothy, Titus, Hebrews, Peter, James. But I wanted to jump to this section right here. So this is another section. If you happen to have the book, page 107. And it's references to the Old Testament histories in the New Testament, right? Well, look at the book of Genesis, Old Testament, and how many references there are in the New Testament. Then look at the book of Exodus. Then look at the book of Leviticus. I mean, numerous New Testament verses go back to these Old Testament books, right? Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then some of the historical books. Why so many New Testament books now talking about the Old Testament? Well, it's an attack on the law. It's basically telling you the law no longer exists, but the law does exist.